families, creating a lifetime of memories. Sadly, some families are denied these important moments due to the sad practice of alienation. These are families divided.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Families Divided TV. Chester and I want to wish all of you a very happy new year, and we're praying so very much that this year there's many more success stories out there regarding alienation and estrangement. We're praying for those of you who have been away from your families for long periods of time, and also for grandparents, many of which who have never ever met their grandchild, such as Chester and myself. We also pray there'll be many more success stories in court. We're praying too for the legislator that there'll be many more bills passed with much success that will be a major help in bringing alienation to a close. I want and pray that you stay strong and trust God through all of this. In tonight's episode, we have with us Dr. Edward Kruk, and he's going to be drawing upon sources from biblical and classical mythology, as well as indigenous native traditions, to examine teachings related to the theme of presumption, the sin of hubris and overreaching, and stories of tragic figures like Icarus in Ovid's Metamorphoses and the raven in native mythology, who, in their attempts to steal light for the benefit of humankind, are punished in the worst possible way for their presumption action. This has got a lot of great info in it. It's chock full of much great information, as usual, from Dr. Kruk. You may want to take notes. It's a great one. We're going to be back in just a moment, right after this important message, with Dr. Edward Kruk.
Divorce and co-parenting are a major life interruption for families, especially the kids, but also for parents and grandparents. And it's even worse in blame-filled, high-conflict cases. When parents engage in alienation by turning the kids against the other parent or grandparents, kids suffer. They're denied the opportunity to build the 4 big skills necessary for future resilience. New Ways for Families online class can help. Parents learn to use our popular BIF and EAR skills to calm the conflict and stop the hostile emails and texts. And we even have a class for kids and parents to learn together. Research shows a 75% improvement in joint parental decision-making after this course is taken, plus overall improvements for kids' well-being. Don't wait to make this affordable investment in your children's future and improve your well-being too. Start learning new ways for your family today at conflictplaybook.com.
Around the world today, fathers generally view themselves as equal parents in regard to their roles and responsibilities toward their children. They're not supported as equal parents, though, by social institutions like the courts and legal systems which, in awarding mothers primary residence and care and control of children after separation and divorce, when parents can't agree on residential arrangements, are effectively removing fathers from the daily routines of parenting, and thereby removing them as responsible fathers to their children. At the same time, many paternal grandparents and extended family members experience a reduction of involvement in the lives of their grandchildren. This situation exists not only in the United States, but around the globe, despite scientific evidence that equal shared parenting is a viable and humane alternative to sole custody and primary residential arrangements. Now, I'll be drawing upon 2 of my books, the first being Divorced Fathers and the second, The Equal Parent Presumption, in which I present my research on divorced dads and argue that the concept of equal shared parenting holds great promise in advancing the needs and best interests, not only of fathers, but of children and families in general. But equal shared parenting is a threat to the power of those who are invested in maintaining the status quo in the realm of family law, meaning the adversarial system. A legal presumption of equal shared parenting as an alternative to sole custody-based adversarial resolution is a presumption in more than one sense. Equal parenting has been marginalized by legal regimes around the globe as a radical idea, an outlandish proposition, an arrogant presumption of misinformed radicals, or a conspiracy of fathers' rights extremists that must be vigorously resisted and eliminated from the public view, kept under wraps, and as one commentator stated, marginalized as an idea that dares not speak its name. Now, equal shared parenting is indeed a radical idea in that it promotes gender equality on several planes. Equality of power, such that neither parent controls or submits to the other in the settlement of their dispute. We're talking about equality of opportunity to actively parent as a key element in equal parenting. Secondly, equality of responsibility and influence in child development. That is, increasing parental authority and responsibility for children and decreasing the state's intrusion into family life. And thirdly, equality of actual time spent with children after separation and divorce between mothers and fathers. These dimensions reflect a child-focused, best interests of the child from the perspective of the child approach to the legal determination of parenting arrangements after separation and divorce, and a responsibility to needs rather than a rights-based adversarial method of determining these arrangements. In my presentation today, I'll be drawing upon sources from classical and biblical mythology, as well as indigenous native traditions, to examine teachings related to the theme of presumption, to the sin of hubris and overreaching, and stories of tragic figures like Icarus in Ovid's Metamorphoses and the raven in native mythology, who in their attempts to steal light for the benefit of humankind, to do good, are punished in the worst possible way for their presumptuous actions. So the title of my presentation today is The Presumptions of Responsible Fatherhood. First, I'd like to examine the evolution of fatherhood and fathering over the past 30 years, which covers the time period over which I've been studying and writing about fathers and the father-child relationship during and after parental separation. Some years ago, we saw an evolution away from the idea of children as fathers' or mothers' property to the notion of children's rights. A century ago, under the doctrine of parens patriae, fathers were considered the head of the family, and as the owners of their children, entitled to full custody and control of their children after parental divorce. This was gradually replaced by the idea of children of so-called tender years were better off under the care and control of their mothers after divorce, and child custody decisions were guided by the principle of the best interests of the child. Fathers were largely excluded from their children's lives after divorce, and the notion of fathers' rights evolved away from the notion of children as fathers' property, which had prevailed in the past, toward the idea that fathers had equal parental rights with respect to their children after divorce, and the fathers' rights movement was born. Today, we're seeing another evolution from fathers' rights to fathers' responsibilities. We're moving away from the notion of fathers' rights to more of an emphasis on the responsibilities of fathers to their children's needs and well-being. We're moving toward more of a child-focused approach. My presentation will be on the notion of responsible fatherhood. That's the prevalent ethos among fathers today, and the pushback that they've experienced in regard to fulfilling their responsibilities to their children's needs. Just as they experienced resistance in regard to asserting their rights as fathers 30 years ago, fathers seeking to fulfill the full spectrum of their responsibilities to their children today are met with opposition and pushback by those who are threatened by the changing face of fatherhood. In particular, fathers today see themselves as equal parents in regard to their roles and responsibilities toward their children. They're not supported in these roles, as I said, by social institutions like the law and the courts, who don't want to see their power and livelihood diminished in regard to regulating family life. Now, Icarus is a figure in Greek mythology who succeeded in flying with wings made by his father Daedalus using feathers secured with wax. Icarus and his father were exiled and imprisoned in Crete, so Daedalus, an inventor, fashioned metal and wax wings to aid them in an escape. Daedalus planned their escape by crafting some wings out of feathers and wax, and together the father and son took their flight out of captivity. Now Daedalus cautioned his son not to fly too close to the sea or the sun, which would destroy his wings. But the youthful brash Icarus lost himself in the joy of flight and soared too high, straight toward the sun. Ignoring the warnings of his father, he wanted to fly high, he chose to fly close to the sun, melting the wax, and he fell into the sea and drowned. The moral of the tale is straightforward. Hubris, overreaching, can be fatal. Now, the myth of the fall of Icarus is also a poem by American poet William Carlos Williams, written in 1960, based on the myth of Icarus. And here is the poem. It reads as follows. Unsignificantly, off the coast, there was a splash quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning. The Fall of Icarus is also a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, painted in 1560, 400 years before the poem, based again on the myth of Icarus. And here is the painting. Both the myth and the poem and the painting have been identified by scholars as centered around one theme in particular, the theme of presumption. The word most commonly used in discussions about the myth and the painting is presumption. Icarus commits the sin of hubris, an overestimation of one's own competence or capabilities. For this presumption, he's not only severely punished as he plunges to his death, but he's completely ignored by the world around him as he plunges to his death. No one cares about his quest to reach the light of the sun. And that's why I chose this myth and painting as a starting point to describe the situation of divorced fathers today. The quest toward and the presumption of egalitarian fatherhood results in severe consequences and an almost complete indifference by the world around them to fathers' suffering and the punishment they face from the actions related to wanting to be equally valued as parents. Often there's contempt for their suffering. They're shamed and ridiculed. Their contempt is often internalized, and thus fathers' estrangement from their children's lives, which is the punishment, is the result of external and internal factors. In my own studies of divorced fathers, I found that parental alienation, paternal alienation, was the result of a combination of systemic forces such as a legal system hostile to them and their own psychological response to the absence of the children, the loss of their role as fathers, and the constraints of being relegated to being mere visitors in their children's lives. This hampered their efforts to be equal parents, and many just gave up the quest. Like the myth of the raven, who steals the light for the benefit of mankind, Icarus may be seen as a tragic hero who seeks the light, seeks the good, ascending closer and closer toward the sun, yet he flies too high and plunges to his death. Fathers who assert their dignity as parents, regardless of the cost, their dignity as equal parents, like Icarus, venture out and fly too high to their peril. They commit the sin of presumption. Some refuse to resign themselves to their fate. They challenge the gods that assign and restrict them to their place. They challenge the authority of the powers that be, but they're ultimately doomed. It's no coincidence that those whose power is threatened by a legal presumption of shared parenting react so viscerally to the word presumption, and specifically to the idea of a presumption in family law. Shared parenting as a presumption has been marginalized by legal and judicial authorities as an outlandish outlandish proposition, an arrogant presumption of fathers' rights extremists that must be strongly resisted and punished. I discuss this idea in my book, The Equal Parent Presumption. Fathers commit the sin of asserting their dignity and equality as parents. Not content to be prescribed and limited by traditional gender roles, they seek to transcend these traditional roles and take an active and equal role in the parenting of their children. They also commit the sin of asserting their authority as parents, refusing to submit to the arbitrary measures of the court. They assert their authority as parents, regardless of the cost. They challenge the power and authority of the court. The painting also says a lot about the condition and response of fellow human beings in the face of suffering and injustice. There's a Flemish proverb, "And the farmer continued to plow," pointing out the ignorance of people to fellow men's suffering. That's especially true when presumption is involved. Icarus, who is the subject of this painting, is virtually invisible in it. We barely see a tiny splash and part of a leg and foot in the bottom right-hand corner of the painting. The plowman, shepherd, fishermen, and sailors in the painting are completely oblivious and disinterested. The moil and shuffle and banality of human life goes on in the face of tragedy, and we see the loss of a golden opportunity for the advancement of human life and well-being. And again, as the American poet William Carlos Williams writes, "Unsignificantly off the coast there was a splash quite unnoticed. This was Icarus drowning." Icarus is virtually invisible in the painting, just as divorced fathers and their fate are invisible and not of any great concern to lawmakers, policymakers, practitioners, and the general public. This despite the grief and trauma that they're subjected to, escalating rates of addiction and mental illness, the suicide epidemic among divorced fathers. My book, Divorced Fathers, Children's Needs and Parental Responsibilities, details the individual stories of 82 of these men. The greatest source of pain for these fathers is the inability to protect their children from the ravages of an absolutely inhumane system, the system that essentially produces parental alienation. And divorced fathers themselves are almost always initially completely surprised by the fact that the injustice has occurred to them, lash out with anger and righteous indignation. With the passage of time, however, they seem to become resigned to their fate, and most, if they survive, lead lives of quiet desperation. In regard to the forced removal of fathers from children's lives, most people are, at best, neutral bystanders when a vital issue of social justice is at stake. We ignore the forsaken cry of fathers and children who are estranged from each other. We're also quick to judge and condemn. And then there are those who come out of the woodwork to exploit others' suffering, shunning, denouncing, ridiculing, shaming, those who gain satisfaction from or seek to exploit the suffering of others, those who seek to maintain their privilege and power and authority, those who are threatened by the presumptions of gender equality in parenting and parental autonomy and authority, those who keenly sense vulnerability and rush in to take advantage and exploit. There are two presumptions of egalitarian fatherhood and shared parenting that incur such hostility from the powers that be: the presumption of equality and the presumption of autonomy. And yet these two principles are exactly what will lead to the best outcomes and optimal well-being of children and families. They are the core principles behind a more enlightened approach to the determination of parenting after divorce when parents can't agree on caregiving arrangements. They're the two core elements of a shared parental responsibility approach to child custody. Well, I've been researching the experiences, attitudes, and presumptions of divorced fathers since 1985. Since that time, I've undertaken two major qualitative studies of divorced fathers, each with a sample of 82 fathers spaced 20 years apart. I completed the first study in 1990 and the second in 2010. In my first study in 1985, I started in 1985, finished in 1990. I undertook a study of the impact of divorce on non-custodial fathers and examined why it was that so many non-custodial fathers lost contact with their children after divorce. The research at that time by US sociologist Frank Furstenberg and others found that fully 50% of non-custodial fathers became completely disengaged from their children's lives. Now, parental alienation theory did not exist at that time, and the stereotype of the deadbeat dad prevailed. It was simply assumed that children did not really matter to fathers. It wasn't until years later that a suicide epidemic among divorced fathers was identified, as the highest levels of depression occur among adults who have a child under age 18 with whom they're not actively involved. I wanted to examine what was behind fathers' disengagement from their children's lives. And I confess that when I first undertook this study, I completely bought into the existing stereotypes of the time. As I'd been a child protection worker, mainly working with single mothers and their children, fathers were completely absent in their children's lives. But in my 1985 research completed in 1990, I found that divorced fathers suffer a grief reaction containing all the major elements of a bereavement, tied directly to the loss and absence of their children in their lives, to the loss of their role as fathers, which was kind of a core component of their identity, and the constraints of a visiting relationship, of an avuncular type of relationship whereas they had been quite involved in their children's lives previously. I also found that they were less likely to be blaming their wives as they were blaming a savage and inhumane legal system that robbed their children of their father's love. I also found, surprisingly, a discontinuity between pre and post divorce father-child relationships. I found that often it was the most involved and attached fathers who were more likely to become alienated from their children's lives because they really pushed for and asserted their rights and asserted their desire to be equal parents. And I concluded that fathers' disengagement from their children's lives was the result of parental alienation, essentially, although I didn't use that word, the result of a combination of systemic forces that removed them from their children's lives and their own psychological response to the absence of their children and loss of the father role, etc. In my second study in 2005, I undertook a second study examining the experiences of divorced fathers. That was completed in 2010. I wanted to see if the situation had improved for fathers. I assumed that it had improved in those intervening 20 years because fathers are now that much more involved in their children's lives prior to separation. I was also interested in the issue of rights versus responsibilities of fathers. Well, in this second study, I found that the situation had actually gotten worse for fathers and their children. That grief reaction I was talking about in my first study had kind of morphed into a much more of a full-blown post-traumatic stress response for fathers. And this year I undertook a third study examining the experiences of grandfathers who'd been alienated from both their children and their grandchildren. And I found that this is an almost entirely invisible, ignored, and highly at-risk population that almost no one is aware of. In all three of these studies since 1985, the most vital issues for fathers and grandfathers as far as remedies are concerned, first of all, is addressing the gender bias toward fathers, the devaluation of fathers, discrimination against fathers. And secondly, they really emphasize the need for equal shared parenting as a legal presumption, as the foundation of family law reform. Now, equal shared parenting as a legal presumption reflects a presumption made by fathers in two respects. It's a presumption of gender equality in parenting with equal rights and responsibilities between fathers and mothers. And secondly, it's a presumption of parental autonomy and authority in the realm of parenting after divorce, which should prevail over the authority of the judicial system in the realm of parenting after divorce. It challenges us to think about whether courts are even necessary, as it focuses on legislation that limits, excuse me, the discretionary power of judges in the family realm. Equal shared parenting as a legal presumption is a threat to the power of women, first of all, in the realm of family law and their entitlement to the custody of children and financial support by their former spouses. And secondly, it's a threat to the authority and power of the judiciary in a realm in which actually they have very little or no training or expertise. It challenges their unfettered discretion to decide parenting after divorce arrangements and to maintain parenting after divorce as a legal rather than a family issue. Both systems favor sole maternal custody when parents can't agree on children's living arrangements, which is associated with the demonization, marginalization, and exclusion of fathers. So equal shared parenting as a legal presumption is described by those with a vested interest in maintaining power in the realm of parenting after divorce. It's described as a conspiracy of fathers' rights extremists, as privileging parental rights over children's best interests, as a way for men to continue abusing their power and domination over women and children, and as a smokescreen for the avoidance of meeting child support obligations, rather than a genuine love for children and a reflection of fathers' deep and abiding primary attachment to their children. The demonization and marginalization of divorced fathers without custody of their children in a society that devalues their importance in their children's lives within a culture of misandry is not only deeply felt by fathers, but is internalized by them. Fathers' lives become steeped in pain, yet the response of society to fathers' affliction is one in which fathers are viewed as responsible for their situation, and the social conditions that lead to their estrangement from their children are ignored. Over time, the revulsion of others toward fathers is turned inward, and this produces despondency and a kind of inertia in fathers. So what's the way forward? How do we overcome this grave injustice to the father-child relationship? First, on the level of civil society, public education aimed at instilling compassion for suffering and affliction, recognition of the injustice rather than indifference or ignoring or shunning or demonizing. Icarus's death, caused by a fall from the sky after the wax holding his artificial wings together melted, is hardly a blip on the radar of the nearby townspeople whose attention is turned instead toward the rhythms of daily life. We need to recognize the tragedy for what it really is. Tragedy is a matter of perspective, a question of perspective, something that depends on how close one is, literally and emotionally, to the event in question. We need to recognize that misguided laws and policies and judicial practices are a huge problem of injustice. Change is most likely to happen through pressure from civil society. We need a presumption of equal shared parenting as the foundation of family law. Second, in regard to fathers' sense of loss and profound grief reaction, their kind of post-traumatic stress that they're enduring, supporting fathers to overcome the internalization of the shaming and blaming of others and to nurture compassion for themselves. Most important, we need to support fathers in the fulfillment of their responsibilities to their children's needs and not to undermine them as we do at present. The name Icarus means the one who reaches the sky. In the myth of Icarus, Ovid writes, quote, "Up and up Icarus flew. He was so high now he could hardly see the ships below, so high that it was hot. He cried out in alarm as feathers began to fall from his wings. The wax was melting. He rolled over to point his head down and dive down as far from the sun as possible, but it was too late. The feathers were falling like snow about him, and he started to plummet. The air, now cold and hard, banged against him. He heard his father cry out. There was nothing he could do. The sea was rushing up towards him. Perhaps if he'd narrowed his shoulders, he might be able to plunge below the surface and come up safe. Daedalus, his father, looked down in impotent despair. He knew that from such a height the sea would be like a bed of granite. He watched the body break on the waves and knew that his son's bones would be smashed to pieces and the life gone from him. O Icarus, my beloved boy, why couldn't you listen? Why did you have to fly so close to the sun? Now in 2 Corinthians, we see Paul reflect on the theme of overreaching. He speaks of great spiritual heights and then being brought down to earth with somewhat of a thud. For Paul, though, the bringing down to earth is not fatal. It is, in fact, essential for humanity's flourishing and growth. There's a call in the passage to not to passive resignation, but rather to active resistance of the status quo, based on a recognition, acceptance, obedience, and trust in an idea which is essentially a gift from God, a light that should be present in our lives, something we must strive for, even when we find ourselves in a perilous situation as we strive for it. Equality and autonomy are essential to responsible parenting and to the well-being and best interests of children. The accomplishment of equal shared parenting will take place quietly, gradually, and anonymously. Such great ideas like equal parenting are at first unrecognized and ignored, like by the plowman in the painting, or simply dismissed. This was the state of the idea of shared parenting when I and others first proposed that this might be a good idea back in the 1980s. It was dismissed by judges and lawmakers alike as an outlandish or simply naive presumption, and dismissed. When the idea began to gain some traction in the 1990s, it was increasingly vigorously opposed as something outlandish and presumptuous and contemptuous. Today, we find the idea is gradually taking hold as more and more states adopt equal shared parenting as the foundation of family law. But there's still a great deal of pushback. And I end and leave you with this quote from Simone Weil. She writes, "Dazzling achievements are possible, which can make a man's name live for thousands of years. But above this level, far above, separated by an abyss, is the level where the highest things are achieved. These things are essentially anonymous." And perhaps that's the real lesson from native, classical, and biblical mythology. Equal shared parenting will not be obtained by means of stealing the light from the gods or flying directly into the sun. Equal shared parenting is a divine gift that must be recognized as such, a light that should be present in our lives to guide us, and something we must strive for even when we find ourselves in a perilous situation as we strive for it. We must never ever give up striving for such ideals. The future of our children and families depends on it.
Next week, Chris Turner discusses creating a new road, rest and reset.